Well, let's dive into our first story. A lot of personnel changes going on, important ones recently.
Yeah, so this really started. It was rumored at first. Some people were doubting if this was going to be true or not, but it ended up being true. The Vatican has confirmed it. Cardinal McElroy has been made the Bishop of Washington, D.C. So, and there was a number of other personnel changes that we'll talk about, but we really want to focus on this one. So, the framing that the mainstream media has put this in, and even some traditionalists, is saying, well, this is really about politics. This is about Pope Francis in an act of retribution against Donald Trump, putting the most progressive, liberal, anti-Trump cardinal in charge of Washington, D.C. And there is something to back that up. Cardinal McElroy has made some pretty inflammatory statements in terms of immigration. I want to go through some of those. And we got to be careful, though, because I think, to some extent, as you alluded to, Brian, there has been a strange, maybe even an overreaction to this that I don't think is proportionate. And it isn't helpful for the traditional movement if we're not really strict with the facts, and we're not looking at the bigger picture. But here's what Cardinal McElroy said. He said, the Catholic Church teaches that a country has the right to control its borders, and our nation's desire to do that is a legitimate effort. At the same time, we are all called to have a sense of the dignity of every human person, and thus plans which have been talked about at some levels of having a wider, indiscriminate, massive deportation across the country would be something that would be incompatible with Catholic doctrine. So we'll have to see what emerges in the administration. So, real quick, the thing I am sort of confused about in the wider traditionalist commentary. Well, if you look at that, that's no different than what you're going to hear with Pope Francis there, and or even some of the past pontiffs. You could look at John the 23rd that says very similar things. So that's not really new. But the media has blown this up, saying, well, this is Trump versus this anti-Trump cardinal. Now, what some people will also point to is that this was in retribution for Trump appointing as the ambassador to the Vatican Brian Birch. And they'll say this is an a rad trad they've put in charge as the ambassador. Not really true. If you look at some of the things Brian Birch has said, I would say he even leans on the Pope-splaining mentality, maybe a little, typical conservative Catholic, a Catholic answers type. For example, the thing that this all really goes back to is a tweet he made back in 2023, where he says, suffice it to say, Pope Francis's actions against his critics, together with progressive Catholic cheerleading, has only vindicated those that warn that synodality was merely a ruse. Is this what walking in the Spirit looks like? Now, that's not some sort of rad trad position. And if that's what sets you up against the hierarchy and makes you a pariah, then I would say, the vast majority of Orthodox believing Catholics are in that category. So I don't really buy it. I could buy that Pope Francis has been informed that this is some sort of rad trad, as they like to call us, but in reality, I don't think that's the case. I think that is slightly overblown. But there's more substance when it comes to criticizing this appointment, definitely. And one of the big things there was the sex abuse cover up. And this is unfortunately going to be a shadow that hangs over the entire conciliar hierarchy. This has infected basically every element of human life, but and especially in the religious world. But this has especially been the case with Cardinal McElroy, and a lot of accusations have been thrown at him, not in his personal doing, but in the cover-up process. Dr. Janet Smith has done a really good job of covering this and giving some various examples. For one of the most prominent examples, and the examples you'll hear in Crisis Magazine or other magazines of this like, is the story of Rachel Mastrogiacomo, who was abused in a satanic ritual by a priest, and and got various strange mystical guidances from priests in the seminary that were telling her all these different things about how she was mystically pregnant and all these things. And that was completely abused by this priest. And unfortunately, the accusations that Dr. Janet Smith alleges, and what Rachel alleges, is that McElroy just did nothing about this. And if you really look at the details of it, which I wouldn't suggest doing, I think some of these things we should indulge our curiosity. But there was a lack of movement on this that really should have been done on the part of Cardinal McElroy, and so that has offended many people. Now we also have to look at the orthodoxy of Cardinal McElroy, which I think is extremely lacking. But my point is to say it's not that substance when it comes to the substance. It's not that different from Pope Francis. For example, one thing I wanted to give is a quote from him, which I think does give a bigger picture. He says, this is him talking about fiducia supplicans, which is kind of something we can judge, is this person orthodox or not. He says, it is wholly legitimate for a priest to decline to perform the blessings outlined in fiducia because he believes that to do so would undermine the strength of marriage. But it is particularly distressing that the opposition to fiducia in our country focuses overwhelmingly on blessings those in the same sex relationships rather than those in men and women who are in heterosexual relationships that are not ecclesially valid. And there's other examples I can give where he equivocates saying we need to accept the LGBT people in the church because, well, there's a lot of heterosexual sin too, but we don't do anything about that. I think that's nonsense. If you follow what traditionalists will say, we criticize Amoris Laetitia just as much as we do Fiducia Supplicans. Amoris Laetitia is allowing, when we're talking about divorced and remarried people, they should not be allowed to go to communion. This is something that, and people in irregular, sinful heterosexual relationships obviously shouldn't be going to communion as well, especially if they're aware of this. So I think that's nonsense for Cardinal McElroy to do, and it just simply doesn't follow. And it's just typical for the progressive cardinals to speak this way. However, he also mentioned this, and this kind of puts him on the far end of the progressivists. He said, talking about the synod, the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood will be one of the most difficult questions confronting the international synods in 2023 and 2024. The call for the admission of women to priestly orders as an act of justice and a service to the church was voiced in virtually every region of the church. At the same time, many women and men participated in the synod, favored reserving the priesthood for men in keeping with the action of Christ and the history of the church. And he goes on to say, either way, the church is going to move in two contradictory directions on this question. So he's obviously not orthodox by any means. He's extremely liberal in regards to moral theology, and it's not somebody you would want to catechize your kids. We'll say that much. But before moving on to the next story, I think it's important just for traditionalists to sit back and ask the question, well, what makes Cardinal McElroy, being the Bishop of Washington, D.C., how is that different from Pope Francis being the Pope? I think if we're really taking this honestly and we're asking, well, what can we do about this? It's not going to be demanding Pope Francis makes Cardinal McElroy resign, because he's not. He's on Cardinal McElroy's team. But the real answer is we have to ask ourselves, because that's the only person we're in control of, should we be involved in these kinds of environments where Cardinal McElroy can thrive, where his sort of theology is being promoted, and where he's widely accepted? In the Novus Ordo environment, you're simply going to be in that milieu. They are the shepherds. They are the leaders of that environment. And in this extraordinary time, unprecedented time of crisis, I think the conclusion we need to draw from this is we need to get away from the heretics. We need to get away from those who are preaching all of this nonsense and find traditional parishes led by traditional priests in a safe environment. But that's my perspective. Do you think, do you share my perspective, Brian? Do you think there's more to the story?
No, I agree, and I liked you using John Venari's one of his favorite lines. I wouldn't let this guy teach my kids catechism. I agree. I wouldn't let McElroy, but I also share your view. He's not some crazy lunatic like he's honestly. I describe him as a company man. He is just the mainstream church, the mainstream conciliar church today, and there's a few other prelates in the American church that are a little more conservative. So relative to them, he seems, but honestly, he's pretty aligned with the rest of the College of Cardinals. So I definitely, and even the fact that he probably, it appears, covered up sexual abuse just makes him more of a company man. That's what they all did. Basically the people there now to some degree or others, some more than others. But yeah, I don't think he's good. I wouldn't, but I think there's a bit of an overreaction. I don't think we're going to get anybody radically different from this.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I think we do have to ask these questions. And I think we have the answer to that. It should be a self-evident answer to these questions. But, if Cardinal McElroy in his wild progressive theology is seen by Pope Francis as implementing his theology properly, and we're saying this guy's crazy, Cardinal McElroy is crazy, you have to go back to the source, and we have to say, well, this is starting from the Vatican. And the reason I'm saying this is there are a lot of Pope splainers to this very day who are going crazy about Cardinal McElroy, but it doesn't make sense. I don't think anybody could find me a spot where Cardinal McElroy has been much more radical than Pope Francis. I think they're actually quite aligned. Now, there's another change in personnel, if you will, that has also been very shocking. Many people have said this is a disaster, that people are going crazy over this, and this is about Bishop Rey in a diocese in France. Now, Bishop Rey was not a trad by any means. He was really known for being a guy who was sort of a big tent figure. He wanted to increase vocations in his diocese, and he did. In some years, his vocations were the highest in all of France. And that's because he really was welcoming of other priests who left other dioceses and came there, and of some more controversial things. And recently, there's been some controversy. At one point, he was told by Pope Francis, wait till the normal retirement age, but I'm going to give you a coadjutor bishop to help you and to really just oversee this whole thing. But he's recently had to step down, and he says it was for two reasons. One was financial problems in the diocese, and the other was his accepting of these religious orders and priests. Now, what some people have gone off and said is, well, this has everything to do with the traditional Latin Mass. He was only done, he was canceled by Francis because of the traditional Latin Mass. I think that's taking it too far, and I think we have to be precise. I don't think that was the particular reason. I'm sure it was part of it, but I don't think it's the whole story. One of the big reasons, if you read the French conversations about this, was about a charismatic Catholic community. So in this charismatic renewal movement, and sort of adjacent to it, which was the Fraternity Eucharistine, which he ordained, I believe, ordained the founder and accepted their community into his diocese. And there's been allegations against this community that are suspicious, and I think it has to raise some suspicions in everyone. And I do think it has to be said, charismatic communities, of course, people watching the show shouldn't step foot in one of these meetings. They're very dangerous, and they're against Catholic orthodoxy. They're against really just kept the Catholic sense, the sense of the faith, but they also can rile one up in this emotional spur and make you vulnerable to abuse. We just have to say that has happened in the past, and we should be cautious of it in the future. This is not in communion with the church of the past. And I think that Pope Francis and the Vatican was skeptical of this. They don't want that on their hands. I think there was some, from what it seems with the reporting, the coadjutor bishop and this bishop didn't get along, and that's a big reason for this. So I don't think the Vatican was totally at fault. If you want some counterpoint to what I'm saying and a bit more criticism of this decision, you can there on Rorate, there's a great article on this. However, I do, and last thing that needs to be said about it, this does contradict the Vatican II theology and the ecclesiology of, well, the bishop, he doesn't need to be really overseen by the Pope. Every bishop is sort of in his own right, has his own authority from himself. And I think that's a fair criticism. That this does go against the decentralization, the synodality that we're always hearing about. But when it comes to just a Catholic perspective, the Pope's job is to manage the flock and to manage these other bishops. And so I can't entirely fault Pope Francis for this. I would rather criticize him more on his blatantly heretical statements at times with all religions lead to God than focusing on this management issue, which he may or may not be at fault with. But what do you think, Brian? Am I wrong on this?
No, I agree completely. I think some people have gone overboard. Certainly, practically, he was good from some traditional groups. I mean, he invited some traditional communities in, and that was good for them. But he's not a traditionalist. I mean, I think now maybe this experience could affect him like Bishop Strickland, who I think is becoming or may even already be traditionalist from conservative. Maybe that'll happen. For his sake, I hope God will touch him. But he really wasn't. I would describe Bishop Dominique Rey as a classical liberal. You used Big Tent, I think, for example, but he just was sort of like, everybody's welcome. Come on in. You have your thing. You do your thing. I'll do my thing. Hey, that increases vocations because we got a lot of different people. Let's do it. I don't think he was committed. I mean, I think what I noticed in Bishop Strickland, even though I wouldn't have say he was traditionalist, he was conservative. I think he saw the goodness and the rightness in the traditional mass. He kept himself a little back until his recent crisis, but I think he did say this is a good thing. Dominic Rey, I think it was just, why are we persecuting these people? They're Catholic. Let's let everybody in, and it's kind of crazy, but I'll let these other crazy people in too. And that really is who he is. So I agree with you. I think there's bigger things that we could criticize than some of the like crazed reactions I've seen to this announcement on some traditionalist, websites and places. Um, uh, there are a lot bigger problems than this.
Yeah, and I think it's disproportionate when you look at some of the past examples. For example,
Yes.
Bishop Strickland or Archbishop Vigano, people might have individual problems with him. I think we've voiced concerns in the past, but
Yeah.
these men were they were persecuted for much graver reasons and reasons that
Yes.
should demand the support of traditional Catholics on this issue.
Yes.
Dominic Rey, Bishop Dominic Rey, I'm not sure that warrants the reaction here that really should have been given when
Mhm.
Archbishop Vigano and Bishop Strickland were in need of it, and which Bishop Strickland is in now. Bishop Strickland is coming more and more on the side of tradition. So we need to,
Yes.
either way, we need to pray for these bishops, pray for the church.
Definitely.